Florida hunter called 911 from a steep hill in the Teton Wilderness after being chased by a grizzly bear that was after his elk carcass. Dispatchers initially thought the man was calling about his dead guide in Jackson Hole. Later investigation by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department confirmed the hunter's worst fears. His friend, Mark Uptain, had been fatally injured during the initial attack and probably died within minutes. Despite having stopped the brutal mauling with a blast of bear spray and staggering 50 yards before succumbing to massive trauma and blood loss. Uptain was able to flee after using bear spray, as was revealed in a report released later after the bear attack by the Department of Game and Fish. But bafflingly enough, this seems to have happened after the fatal wounds were already there. Why? In order to understand, we must recount the events as they happened from the very start. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-September 2018, Corey Cuban's crossbow hit a raghorn bull orc with a poor shot in Terrence Mountain. Terrence Mountain is the large peak located 6 air miles from the Turpin Meadow trailhead where Uptain was with his hunter. Both Uptain and Cuban were unable to locate the elk initially, but when returning to the spot where it was hit the following afternoon, they discovered a massive blood trail. After following it into the woods, they came across the undiscovered elk body at about lunchtime. At that moment, it might have seemed like a triumph for them, but little did they know that stepping near the elk carcass was the last mistake Uptain would ever make. It was a warm day with a high of 73 degrees in neighboring Moran. So while field dressing the elk, Uptain removed his shirt and left it and the black nylon shoulder strap holding a Glock 10mm handgun 5 or 10 yards uphill of the carcass. Uptain had his bear spray canister hanging from his left hip holster, but Cuban would later say he kept it in his pack since it was cumbersome to hold while riding. Uptain was cutting off the boar's head when he and Cuban heard nearby boulders beginning to fall. Uptain, an experienced guide, immediately perked up. But even that split-second reaction came too late, for what he saw was 2 hulking grizzlies running straight at him. Cuban later reported that Uptain's initial reaction was waving his arms and yelling. In the split second before he was struck and viciously mauled. When first introduced, the adult sow Bruin was the more aggressive of the 2 Bruins, while the fully developed cub was just moving around in the background. As a reflex, Cuban reached for Uptain's Glock on the surrounding stack of equipment, but he was unfamiliar with the mechanism of the slide, located on the top of the weapon, and used to chamber a bullet. The gun was utterly useless in Cuban's hands. He did not know how to operate it. Cuban attempted to toss the gun to the man who knew how to wield it, Uptain, when the bear shifted its attack to him. The gun missed Uptain, and the 15 full metal-jacketed 10mm rounds in the magazine were inadvertently ejected by Cuban as he tried to release the safety. After analyzing the firearm, the Teton County Sheriff's Office concluded that it was in working condition. It could have saved Uptain's life. Cuban later said the bear seized his right boot with its mouth, but he was able to dodge it. Following a brief altercation, Cuban sustained cuts to his right arm and fingers, abrasions to his left knee, and a puncture wound to his ankle. Mysteriously, Cuban would later tell the media that the grizzly let him go and turned its attention back to Uptain. It was at this point that Cuban ran. He did not make an attempt to save Uptain, leaving the guide to his death. Cuban would then fly out of Jackson Hole Airport, refusing medical treatment in the process. According to Cuban, who spoke to Game and Fish, Uptain was last seen on his feet fighting with the bear. However, according to a Teton County Sheriff's Office report attached to the investigation, Cuban saw Uptain bleeding severely and being dragged and screaming as the grizzly tore into him in the final moments of his life. Cuban said the wind was blowing, and when he left the attack site and ran to 2 horses 300 or 400 yards uphill, he didn't hear any more cries or gunshots. Around 4:30 p.m., Cuban rode his horse to the peak of Terrence Mountain, where he discovered a cell signal, called for help, and waited for 2 hours before being airlifted out of the wilderness. During his initial 911 call, he reported that the guide is dead to dispatch. Time ran out after a quick aerial search for Uptain. What happened after Cuban ran away is unclear, but the Game and Fish inquiry claims that its reconstruction of the events does not include speculation about details not supported by evidence. Game and Fish employees would later go on to kill the 250-pound grizzly that mauled Uptain to death. 2 separate sets of bite marks would later go on to be discovered on Uptain's body, leading investigators to speculate that the bear cub was also involved in the attack. Game and Fish would go on to euthanize the young grizzly as well. Uptain had 38 puncture wounds and 14 tearing or ripping wounds in all, but the upper thighs on both his legs were the chief injuries he sustained during the fight for his life, having been extensively torn and ripped and experiencing massive blood loss. The hunting guide's skull was intact in the exposed area, but his scalp had been torn off from his forehead to his neck due to a crushing wound. Game and Fish investigators and Teton County Coroner Brent Blue would go on to disagree on the nature of Uptain's fatal wound and whether or not he would have been able to recover from it for a long time after his death. According to Blue, who did not investigate the crime scene, Uptain would have died instantly if he had been bitten in the head. A post-mortem investigation report written by Teton County Deputy Coroner Dave Hodges does not include the fatal cranial lesion to which Blue alluded. State law also conveniently prevented autopsies from being included in the report of Mark Uptain's brutal death. According to the investigative report, Hodges informed Game and Fish investigators that Uptain's death was sadly rapid but not instant. The investigation into the incident lent credence to the theory that Uptain managed to stop the bear attack with bear spray before walking away and collapsing. There was certainly evidence at the scene that supported such an angle. Uptain was standing after suffering bites to the head and thighs, as evidenced by the crusted blood on the bear spray canister and by the blood trickling down his neck, shoulders, and boots. Neither signs of a struggle nor bear tracks were present when Teton County Sheriff Sergeant Chad Hooper discovered Uptain's body around 1:30 p.m. The night after Uptain's death was verified, 3 leg-hold traps were set and baited with elk flesh from the scene. The morning following the encounter, 5 scientists and wardens rode a helicopter over Terrace Mountain without being able to verify whether or not their trap actually worked. When Dan Thompson, Kyle Lash, John Stevens, Brian Baker, and Mike Boyce of Game and Fish got to the site, they heard balls that suggested the cub had been trapped. But the sow was free and, at first, aggressive towards the men who approached her. The decision to kill the bear was reached on the spot, and Lash and Baker opened fire. The cub was tranquilized, examined, and ultimately killed. Forensic and DNA testing later revealed that both bears were responsible for the attack on Mark Uptain. Although grizzlies are known to be hostile towards humans when in close proximity, Game and Fish officials have stated that this particular attack exhibited neither the predatory nor defensive-aggressive tendencies typically associated with bears. The inquiry report concluded that grizzlies rarely attack humans with the aim of devouring them, and that most attacks were in defense of food, cubs, personal space, or some mix of the 3. Investigators, however, found that the bear's behavior in this case was abnormal. What drove them to kill Uptain? We will perhaps never know. Uptain's bravery in the face of the attack, as well as the controversy surrounding the use of bear spray, propelled the tragic incident to the forefront of the nation's consciousness. Mark Uptain was survived by his wife Sarah and 5 children they raised together. Anyone who knew Mark Uptain knew he was a loving husband and father, and his loss was a great tragedy and insurmountable loss for the community. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Let us never forget the lessons learned from this tragedy, and always be prepared for the unpredictable dangers of the wilderness. Should you wish to stay informed of other similar stories, please do not hesitate to subscribe to our channel. Until next time, farewell.